Hello, and welcome to Obscure History. In this video, we will delve into the life and times of the Seleucid monarch Antiochus II Theos. Unlike his predecessors, this Antiochus does not have as many ancient accounts that have survived into the present day. Most of what we know about him comes from Appian of Alexandria, a wealthy Roman of the upper class who was active between 96 to 165 AD. His work, The Syrian Wars, draws from a collection of earlier accounts and histories and is probably by far the best preserved works on the Seleucids as a whole. I would highly recommend to anyone who is interested in learning more on the Seleucids to go through these secondary sources. So with that said, let us delve straight into it. Antiochus was born in Syria, most likely in the western capital of the Empire of Antioch in 286 BC. He was the second-born son of Antiochus I Soter, with his older brother being named Seleucus. He also had at least two sisters, Apama and Stratagems, both second of their names, who would in time go on to marry into other Hellenistic monarchies. We have absolutely no sources on Antiochus' upbringing until in 268, when his father Antiochus I Soter had the older brother Seleucus executed on charges of treason. This news must have been quite the shock to the younger Antiochus, but what followed would have been more predictable. At the age of 18, Antiochus would have been seen as a full adult, and as the second son of the elder Antiochus, his position as heir was unquestioned. Indeed, it did not take long for his father to recognize him as his heir officially in the same year of 268. Even had his brother not been executed, it is highly likely that Antiochus would have been appointed as satrap of an important region of the empire to tie him over. By June of 261 BC, the older Antiochus died, leaving Antiochus II as Basileus of the Seleucid Empire. Only 1 year into power, Antiochus II kick-started the Second Syrian War with the Ptolemies to set things right after the somewhat humiliating stalemate in the first conflict. This war was instigated in conjunction with the Seleucids' ally in Europe, Antigonid Macedon. When Antiochus reached out to the Basileus of Macedon, Antigonus II Gonatus, for another personal alliance between the two houses, Antigonus thought, why not? The influence of Ptolemy II Philadelphus in mainland Greece was becoming too much to bear for the Antigonid ruler. With Antigonus setting off with his navy and Antiochus with his land forces, Ptolemy found his position being pushed back, particularly in western Anatolia, where the Seleucids gained several successes. By 259 to 258 BC, Antiochus gained control over the important cities of Ephesus and Miletus. In the case of Miletus, it had been subject to the Ptolemaic-backed tyranny under Timarchus, who had managed to alienate most of the city against him. By the time Antiochus came knocking on the doors of the city, the Milesians had had enough of the tyrant. Seeing the Seleucids as liberators, the Milesians were all too eager to join Antiochus's cause. Brushing aside whatever resistance there was, Timarchus was quickly put to death and the city was brought into the Seleucid fold. The grateful citizens of Miletus bestowed the title of Theos, meaning God, onto Antiochus, declaring that he was divine and that he had delivered them salvation from Timarchus's tyranny. At around the same time, the now named Antiochus Theos also re-established a Seleucid presence in Thrace. Whilst it is not known how far this presence extended, we know that coins were minted at the port city of Byzantium, depicting the king's bust and name for a time. We know that by 257 BC, Antiochus married his daughter Stratagems III to the king of Cappadocia, Ariarathes III. It is unclear if part of the conditions was for Ariarathes to bend the knee to the Seleucids, but this would have created a friendly buffer state in the north at the very least. In the same year of 257, we know of a Ptolemaic push towards Seleucid-controlled Syria, but nothing is known about this, so it can only be assumed not a lot happened, or the Seleucids were able to quickly repel the invaders. By 253 BC, Ptolemy Philadelphus had had enough of the fight and so offered seemingly favourable terms to Antiochus. This involved the recognition of all the lands that the Seleucids had conquered, but also stipulated that Antiochus was to divorce his current wife, Laodice I, in exchange for marrying Ptolemy's own daughter, Berenike. She is also known as Berenike Pharenophoros, the dowry bringer, or Berenike Syria. Whether it was Ptolemy's intention or not, this marriage offer was effectively a political coup and would have serious repercussions for the Seleucid Empire in the near future. It certainly wouldn't be the last time the Ptolemies would interfere in the house of Seleucus. This bust on screen is of Ptolemy Philadelphus, by the way. However, this also worked the other way round, as there are a few instances of Seleucid princesses marrying into the Ptolemaic royal household, so this may have been a sincere offer made by Ptolemy Philadelphus in order to bind the two kingdoms closer together and to make the prospect of peace more concrete. If that was the intention all along, then this ended up backfiring horribly, but we'll get to that when the time is right. Following the conclusion of the Second Syrian War, Antiochus had avenged the stalemate which his father had left the two sides in. Having silenced all external threats to his realm, he was quick to act militarily. However, he had sown the seeds for internal instability with the marriage of the Ptolemaic princess Berenike. This part of the agreement was also made with the understanding that any children born from this marriage would go on to inherit the Seleucid realm. But Antiochus and his former wife Laodice already had two sons, creatively named Seleucus and Antiochus. Not long after the remarriage, Antiochus and Berenike would have a son also named Antiochus, who was now the presumed heir. His remarriage had effectively alienated him from his first family, and it was only going to be a matter of time before the pot would boil over. In the interim period following the Second Syrian War, Laodice was given vast estates in Anatolia to oversee, along with her children. According to surviving inscriptions, of which we have quite a few, we can gather that Laodice remained a very powerful figure within the empire. One such inscription goes as far as to name the lands granted to her as royal possessions. There also seems to be multiple instances of intrigue on her part to become queen again, but what this exactly entails we are not certain of. Laodice's heritage would play a very important role in the coming dynastic squabble, for her father was Achaeus, the brother of Seleucus I Nicator. So far, the two branches of the family had worked closely together, but Antiochus II would change all of that in time. Unfortunately for us, we aren't all that sure about the domestic policies employed by Antiochus Theos. We know that he continued his predecessor's policies of building up the Greco-Macedonian presence throughout the empire by laying the foundations for new settlements. This is hardly surprising given that the Seleucids were a foreign monarchy who relied heavily on a solid core of loyal Greco-Macedonians in the army to keep the Basileus' position stable. Many of these newer settlements would bear the name of his first wife, like the example seen here. This particular foundation was built on an older settlement which went by a few different names, such as Diospolis and Rondas. Built next to the Lycus River in southwest Anatolia, it was dubbed as Laodicea ad Lycum, meaning Laodicea on the Lycus. The remaining ruins that can still be seen are a testament to this Laodicea's strategic placement along a major trade route. These ruins include a stadium, baths, multiple temples, a gymnasium, 2 theatres, and a Bouleutrion or Senate house for the local magistrates. What you see here are the remains of one of the temples built in the Antonine period of Rome in the 2nd century AD, but this goes to show that this Laodicea held an important position in this region long after the Seleucids actually fell. In terms of his policies for the upper satrapies in the east, we know even less in this regard. What is clear, however, is that Antiochus II gave very little of his personal attention to this vast and unruly region of the empire due to the conflicts with Egypt. I also wouldn't be surprised if the remarriage also had a role to play in his unwillingness to oversee the Far East. Had he left the West to go east, with the growing tensions and factionalism remaining high, it's possible that he could have seen major civil unrest in his lifetime throughout Anatolia and Syria. There are 2 points I would like to bring to the forefront which supports the remarriage playing a critical part in his unwillingness to go east. Firstly is the fact that he still didn't go eastward despite putting the Ptolemies in their place. With the heart of the western part of the empire secured through military might, it would have made sense for Antiochus to leave a strong position in Syria whilst he went on a tour of the east to assert his position there. Surely he must have seen the amount of unrest within the Seleukid royal family that was steadily clawing its way to the surface. This meant his personal presence was required in order to keep the peace in the west. This leads me quite nicely to my second point. If Antiochus couldn't personally go east, then he could only do one other thing. He needed strong-minded individuals to act as governors of these vast territories. After all, these satrapies were located far away from the main imperial administration, and we have already seen that the nomads of the Great Northern Plains were no strangers to launching periodic raids into these remote parts of the empire, such as those that had taken place under Antiochus I Soter. This reasoning seems to make some sense of Antiochus's decision to do this. 2 particular people appointed stand out above the rest. A man named Androgoras was set up to run the satrapy of Parthia, whilst another individual named Diodotus was put in charge of Bactria. Of course, they would nominally view Antiochus as their overlord, but it would not take long for these strong-willed satraps to start testing the boundaries of what they could get away with, and it would ultimately prove to be another disastrous policy implemented by Antiochus Theos. One perfect example of this breaking away from central control is a series of coins that were minted under Diodotus, replacing the dynastic bust usually reserved for the Basileus with that of his own, whilst retaining the notion that he was merely minting them under the name of Antiochus. Numismatists and historians working in the field of Greco-Bactrian coins, such as Jens Jacobsen, suggests that these coins were minted under a different Antiochus, who was part of the Diodotid dynasty that would emerge. Whilst being technically plausible due to the murky chronology surrounding the Greco-Bactrians, most professionals are of the opinion that Diodotus was simply testing the waters by seeing what he could get away with without any backlash from the Seleukid monarch. Speaking further on the numismatic evidence, it also seems that Antiochus Theos utilized the image of his late father on the Seleukid coinage of the East. This was a common tool that leaders would use in order to shore up their legitimacy and to remind the common people of the good and stable times that were brought about by that particular person. It seems that Antiochus's final years in power were quite uneventful. By 246 BC, he was residing at the capital of Antioch with Bernice and their infant child Antiochus. He was only 40 years old, so he could naturally assume he still had a long while left of ruling the empire himself. But fate had other plans for him. In the same year, news would have reached the Basileus that the pharaoh of Egypt, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, had died. Antiochus knew that the personal peace settlement established between the 2 monarchs had become null and void. Most likely upon receiving this news, he decided he wanted to get back together with Laodice, who was still residing in Ephesus in Anatolia. Leaving behind Bernice and his infant son, Antiochus arrived in Ephesus later in 246, but soon died shortly afterwards. His body was interred in the Belevi Mausoleum, located 14 kilometers northeast of Ephesus. This mound you can see is what remains of it today. The tomb was originally constructed on the orders of Lysimachus, the successor who was defeated at the Battle of Corpedium in 286 BC by Antiochus's grandfather, Seleucus I Nicator. Even at the time, it was widely believed that Laodice had him poisoned shortly after they had reunited due to the perceived slight of being replaced as queen. Whilst it's easy to fall into the stereotype of a powerful woman using poison as their weapon of choice, it can't be denied that Laodice had the motivation, means, and personal access to the king in order to carry out such retribution. It's safe to say that his death would open up a whole load of issues for the Seleucid Empire, but that will all be discussed at another time. For someone who doesn't have nearly as much written about him from the ancient accounts, we are still able to build a relatively good picture of who Antiochus Theos was as a person. For starters, he had a strong presence about him, particularly when it came to military affairs. He was able to successfully regain control of the lands lost under his father and then some. We're unsure if he led his armies personally, but I believe he did, given how it was such an ingrained thing to do throughout his family's rule. As I mentioned before, the Seleucid dynasty was a foreign one when we look at the peoples they ruled over, and so a key factor that kept one in power is the loyalty of an army which had a solid core of Greco-Macedonians. Overall, his greatest mistake was undoubtedly agreeing to remarry in the name of peace. I think had he just not agreed to it and continued the war until better terms were reached, we would be ranking him as one of the better Seleucid monarchs. Even whilst he was still alive, it was always going to be an issue when he already had 2 sons from an earlier union. Surely he must have known that. I find it very hard to believe that someone can be that oblivious to such a major issue involving the succession. However, I do recognise that he had essentially placed himself in between a rock and a hard place. Divorcing Berenike would have been an insult to the Ptolemies, which would only lead to more war, but being in the marriage had alienated him from his original and rightful family. With scheming and intrigue already playing out before him, I am of the opinion that he felt the need to stay in the west in order to keep the dynasty from preemptively ripping itself apart, which meant he neglected the easternmost satrapies of his kingdom. This of course meant the appointment of independent-minded governors, which in turn would lead to the formation of Parthia and Bactria breaking away as independent realms. The matter of his death is somewhat suspect. If he was poisoned by Laodice, then it would give Antiochus the distinction of being the first Seleucid monarch to be killed at the hands of his own family. As a sneak peek, later Seleucid history is rife with family murders, so we have Laodice to thank for starting that trend, if it's true. Whilst he did well to continue many of the policies of his predecessors, his fateful decision to remarry will see all the good that he achieved reversed the moment he died. For the reasons I have explained in this video, it seems the empire was left far worse because of him. Thank you for watching part 3 of this ongoing series. I hope you have enjoyed learning more about our first more obscure Seleucid ruler. Next time, the death of Antiochus II Theos will leave the empire rocked and shaken to its core, with both internal and external threats crashing at the gates. It will be the task of Seleucus II Callinicus to try and keep the trireme steering on course through the chaos that will unfold. If you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like and perhaps a comment? Until next time, this has been Obscure History.